All right, I'll try this. You guys can hear me okay, yes? So thank you to Carrie, thank you to the committee for having me, and thank you all for coming out. Maybe it's easier if I do this. That was okay? It is indeed, actually, October 22nd was Bob Rauschenberg's 100th birthday. So
It's November. Oh my God.
it's actually October. So we have started the centenary in Fort Myers, where I now reside and am director of the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery. We actually managed to get the mayor to make it Bob Rauschenberg Day in the city of Fort Myers, but there are really worldwide celebrations going on. So lots of museums, even locally, the Orlando Museum of Art has currently a small exhibition that they've pulled from their collection. Some of you may have seen it. But the Ringling Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville, everybody seems to be sort of pulling the things that they have in their collections or having planned for some time major exhibitions. Those things are happening too. So if you get up to New York, actually the Guggenheim has a big Rauschenberg exhibition. In Houston, the Menil, anyway, Hong Kong, all over. But love this picture of Bob. It's great to be here at Space U to talk about this sort of first ever project to do with space art. And with that, I'm also going to tell you, and I hope you'll forgive me, but a lot of my own kind of personal history and sort of how I got to be in the position that I am and working at the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery. Bob had a deep connection both to Florida in that he was a full-time really resident for decades, but also part of that was that he came because of NASA early on, and we'll talk more about that as well. But the first thing that really brought Bob to Florida was in 1958, he had assigned himself the task of illustrating Dante's Inferno. He was dyslexic, he had a hard time sort of reading. This was not an easy task for him, but he wanted to do a sort of contemporary Dante. And in 1960, or right around that period, he found a little fisherman's wharf down on Treasure Island on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and he stayed and illustrated the Inferno. Those drawings are now in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection, but he would always joke later when he found and discovered what would become his home on Captiva Island that he had to go through hell to get to Florida. And it was because he had illustrated Dante. And the real story, though, or another part to the story that is less talked about, is that by 1966, Rauschenberg was already sort of world-renowned. He'd won the Venice Biennale, and he was in a position where he felt a lot of pressure being in New York. A lot of friends were going through psychoanalysis and coming up with ways to sort of deal with their daily stresses, but for Bob, he went to see an astrologer, Zoltan Mason, and that astrologer did his chart, and in fact, Zoltan Mason suggested that he needed to stay away from the mountains and find a coastal environment where he could live that was sort of a beachfront sort of property. And he traded, actually at the time, a painting for a Jaguar automobile, and that was his escape from New York. A collector made this trade with him, and he would drive as he escaped New York and tried all the exits on the way south until he got down to Captiva. And at that point, he was really looking for isolation. So as he discovers Captiva, there wasn't even a bridge, actually. It was, at the time, there was a ferry to get to Captiva Island. So it was truly an isolated existence. But in one of his most famous prints, this is Booster, that has a full body X-ray. It's sort of a self-portrait. The background to that print is the original sort of Zoltan Mason star chart that led him to making the move to Florida. And that's a print that was done at Gemini GEL. But in 1968, he finds this little property. He discovers Captiva. He falls in love with Captiva. And he buys this, which becomes his sort of beach house. We'll talk more about as we move forward. But that was getting to Florida. This is more to my sort of personal story to give you a little background. My great-grandfather, I don't know if there are baseball fans here at all, but a few. Okay, my great-grandfather was a baseball Hall of Famer, And as I grew up, he lived until I was almost 20 years old. He was well into his 90s, and he had cataracts. He was in great physical shape, but he couldn't see very well. So our weekend routine was that I would help him with his fan mail. And even into his 90s, he would get lots and lots of letters, and he was really generous about signing autographs. But it, for me, became a way of both seeing all of these people writing to him as their hero, and that you could reach your heroes with just a letter. And also you'd see these creative letters that would come, and those would be the ones that would catch our interest immediately, and those that were really sincere. You'd get a case of baseballs from an autograph dealer in New York who just wanted to sell things, and that we'd pay less attention to than something that was coming that was clearly from a real fan. So not being a fan of baseball really, or connected with baseball, I'd grown up around Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and Yogi Berra and all of these famous baseball players. I got interested in art. And actually my mother had clipped an article that was about Rauschenberg that had followed him for a day on Captiva. And in the article, they talked about how he would sleep late, he would stay up working very late at night in the studio. This is sort of the rock star studio at the top. This is part of his compound on Captiva. He became the largest landowner on Captiva Island, and this is the fish house, a stilted building that is also connected to his property, where he's standing here in front. But the article followed him for the day essentially, and mentioned that he was a big drinker, and that before going to work, he would often walk the beach, and he would have a drink at this little local bar. So knowing from responding to lots of fan mail from my great-granddad that had I written to Rauschenberg care of like the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, or even had I gotten his address, there would certainly be gatekeepers, and the likelihood that it would land in his hands was slim. So what I did was I wrote, and I'm probably 15, 16 years old at the time, but I wrote a fan letter to Bob that was to Mr. Robert Rauschenberg, very politely, but care of the Mucky Duck Pub. And the Mucky Duck Pub was, and I got their address, but the Mucky Duck Pub was 200 yards down the beach from Bob's house, and that's where he would often hang out. And with that letter, I said, very sincerely, I'd read this article, I was really interested in his work, I was a fan of art, and that I'd enclosed $10, let me buy you a drink, knowing that he would have a toast at sunset, right? So much to my amazement, within a couple of weeks, Bob had just returned from China. He was beginning what would become this world tour. We'll talk more about that. But as he was returning, I had a knock on the door. My parents yelled to me, and I had to sign for something. And it was a big tube, canceled Captiva Island. And in it was this lithographic poster, but inscribed for Jade from Bob Rauschenberg. He'd just come back from this trip to China, so this was the exhibition poster, a lithograph that he had created, and this handwritten note that said, I'll have that drink and wish you luck just before I go to work tonight. I've put a gift in your pocket, best RR. So that was my personal connection. That's actually, I'm sure, the reason I got the job at the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery. Ultimately, people seem to love that story. So just to give you some sense of it, the letter, it's many years now later that I've sort of thought more about the way that he talked about, or his response to me about putting a gift in my pocket. It turns out that Bob Rauschenberg used to carry lots of stuff on his person, like little weird things that he would keep in his pockets, things that he would collect from somewhere, picking up a rock in some faraway place. But also, it's said that he had a mummy's eye that he kept in his pocket as well. And the idea was, if he was at a dinner party and it got really boring or people weren't talking, he could pull something odd out of his pocket and start up a conversation, So the idea of miniature things, keeping them on your person, and or having things that are things you can talk about to engage people, I think is a really important idea. It's also an idea that happens through time in terms of art. So one artist you may well be aware of is Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp, for example, decided that he would create a kind of retrospective in a valise, in a suitcase. And this is a work where he made all of his important works in miniature and then could have them be portable, right? So, so similar to kind of Bob's idea. Duchamp, of course, was a huge influence on Rauschenberg. No denying that. There were other artists. It's getting cut off a little bit. This is Robert Filiu, who was a Fluxus artist. Filiu actually had a, it's okay, but yeah. Filiu actually had a hat that he created, oh wow. Awesome, sorry. Great. So Filiu actually would walk around with a hat, and in the hat he would make exhibitions. So solo exhibitions of his work, but sometimes he would invite other artists to make shows too. Very much in the spirit of Marcel Duchamp, but a kind of Fluxus-related artist who had this idea of making miniature things. If someone asked him on the street what he did, he might say he's an artist, but he also might say he was a gallerist. And if they said, well, where's your gallery? He'd say, well, it's here. Would you like to see the current exhibition? And take his hat off his head and share the exhibition, right? So all of these things also connect with what we'll wrap up with in talking about the Moon Museum. But my first real curatorial project was as I was writing, about the time of writing a fan letter to Rauschenberg in my teens, this book came out, and my parents, knowing I was interested in art, bought this book, and it's called A Sketchbook with Voices, and Jerry Saltz, who's still a well-known art critic, and Eric Fischel, well-established artist, went to their friends and decided that they would do a blank sketchbook, hardbound sketchbook, but with sort of questions, instruction, ideas for a young artist, an established artist, any artist who kind of was lacking a way forward to flip a page and then have some sort of instruction. Tying one hand behind your back, or make something with one hand, or do your own work but use someone else's clothes, or make something white-black. So many artists contributed to this book. My parents thought I was going to start drawing or doing something in the book. I had started to write to artists. I was in touch even by then with not only Rauschenberg, but Keith Haring and a few other artists that were important to me as I was starting to learn about art. So I started circulating this book, actually. And I would write to the artists and I would say, you know, I've got this book. Would you be interested in, you know, answering a question or contributing to it in some capacity? So William Wegman did drawings in the book. That's actually Dwayne Hansen to the right. Ultimately, Keith Haring, a bunch of other artists, did things in this book that became a kind of portable exhibition. And finally, Rauschenberg's dear friend John Cage, the composer and artist, I thought the book was lost. I'd sent it to him and it didn't come back, and it was months. And I think he'd been traveling, but eventually the book returned and it became kind of the final project in the book back in 1988, where Cage then simply inscribed it, "I have looked through this book, John Cage." And he wrote me a letter at the time saying how busy he was with other things, and would I consider that a Duchampian contribution, that he'd been enjoying the book, he just hadn't thought of kind of what to do in it, right? So, so this, to me, reflecting on my own personal history, becomes kind of the first curatorial project I ever did. I also, around that time, bought a work of art. I really thought of this as a work of art. Rauschenberg, as it turns out, did a commercial sort of record in a somewhat limited edition, tens of thousands, it might have been 100,000 that were produced for the Talking Heads, for their album. He was doing the revolvers, which had different sort of plates of imagery that then would circulate. And here he created a transparent record with their album in a transparent container, but the imagery sort of spun inside this transparent package design. David Byrne, who we've worked with a number of times, who's the lead singer, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer from Talking Heads, David would always joke that the album didn't win a Grammy, but Bob did. And in fact, he won a Grammy for doing the package design for the Talking Heads. during this time. But for me, it was also one of the first things that was accessible. You know, you go to the record store and you could buy one of these, and if you knew who Rauschenberg was, it was actually like buying a multiple, buying a real artwork somehow. When I got to New York, I started working with artists, and of the generation when I arrived, you guys are probably aware of this artist. This is Maurizio Cattelan. I think this week, the America, the gold toilet, sold for more than $12 million. That's the taped banana. Well, Maurizio had just arrived in New York when I got there, and we became sort of fast friends, and I did the first project with Maurizio Cattelan outside of New York City, the first museum project with him. So this is me with Maurizio many years ago, and Maurizio was trying to find ways to provoke and also to escape, in a way, the art world just as he was entering it. So there were many projects where, you know, he would propose these outrageous things. And I brought him, at the time, to Florida for a project he titled, Choose Your Destination, How to Get a Museum Paid Vacation. And I convinced the director of the Contemporary Art Museum in Tampa to let us do this. She gave us $1,000 and we stayed at my parents' house and used my mom's car and drove around, but to Disney World and to Busch Gardens and doing typical touristy stuff. Maurizio at the time documented it through photographs, but also we ended up hiring a caricature artist from Busch Gardens to meet us every morning at a coffee shop. We'd have a coffee with her, and she would make a portrait of Maurizio based on his description of what he'd done the day before. It was all bullshit. I mean, he would say, you know, he was surfing and he was, you know, here he's on the Kumba, which we actually did. He pulled me onto the Kumba at Busch Gardens for this loop-de-loop roller coaster. I hate roller coasters. But anyway, so this is a piece from a caricature artist of Maurizio at the time that we had him for this project. The Contemporary Art Museum in Tampa never would promote this. They were really worried that the director of the museum would be fired for us being given $1,000 to come, the two of us, to spend a week and to just do touristy things. So it's a very little known project by Maurizio, actually. But prior to that, there was also a project that Rauschenberg did. Again, kind of like the idea of the, you know, album packaging. But here, Bob liked the idea of doing a limited edition sort of print, actually working on the presses at the Miami Herald. He did an insert for Tropic magazine. The idea was to do the biggest multiple ever, 650,000 copies, but kind of, you know, custom printed or whatever, and designed only for the newspaper. This would lead to me later, in the late 90s, working with a number of artists to do newspaper full-page works of art that would exist only there. We called it Art in the News, and it was with the Contemporary Art Museum in Tampa, but the first artist was actually William Wegman that we invited and brought. We had some incredible artists through the run of the project, and we would bring each of them to give a talk in conjunction with them running a page in the Tampa Tribune that went as a work of art. At the end of the 12 months, it was one artist per month. This is Lorna Simpson on the left, that's William Wegman on the right. At the end of the 12-month period, the Museum of Modern Art called up and said, we know it only took place in the paper. Did anyone save the newspapers? And we'd like them for our permanent collection. So thankfully, we'd kept a few issues of each of those newspapers each month, and we're able to provide MoMA with a set of all the newspapers. Ed Paschke, Alan McCullum, some of those projects. When I got to the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery, I've been there now 12 years. Rauschenberg has been deceased for 17 years. So this is the centenary. He died 17 years ago. He was then deceased by 4 or 5 years when I arrived. And they had done a memorial, but there had not been another Rauschenberg show in the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery. It was really important to me that we honor his legacy, find a way to bring him back. The former director really, I think, didn't know how to do a Rauschenberg show without Bob's presence, because people would come and meet and greet him and loved his presence. So I started by inviting Yoko Ono to do a big project in the gallery, and that sort of brought us back in terms of community interest. Yoko did the first of what would be 3 different billboards over the last 10 years for us during that time, so you're seeing all 3 of those billboards. But upon my arrival, she did an exhibition that was all sort of site-specific in the gallery, and then I began working on trying to get Bob back. That was going to take a little more time because I felt like we had to do that really thoughtfully. I'll show you a couple of images of that. This is another artist we brought, not long after my arrival, but just to give you a sense of how ambitious we are. Although, again, we're a community college, basically state college, with essentially an associate's degree. Our gallery has a modest budget, but we've really tried to be ambitious about everything we do. That's a maquette for creating Thomas Edison's swimming pool in our gallery. That's Keith Edmier, and this was the result, actually. To scale, you walked into this collapsed wall, and then you had Thomas Edison's pool, thousands of pounds of cementitious material. The first Rauschenberg show, I felt like we needed to really talk about his history and talk about his importance beyond the local. So it was really important that Rauschenberg went to China. If you talk to artists that were alive at the time from China, if you talk to Su Bing or Ai Weiwei, which I've done, they will say there was art in China before and after Rauschenberg. That's the impact that he had there. It was tremendous, right? I mean, he was a kind of great permission giver in terms of the work. And so one of the things that he did while he was doing this world tour, Rocky, was he created in China, or through imagery that he took in China, a 100-foot-long photograph that was continuous, not like today on an Epson printer or something like that. This was actually lab-printed color photography on the largest sheet of paper that Eastman Kodak could provide. Extraordinary. So we rounded the walls of the gallery. This is the first Rauschenberg show that I did in the gallery, and talked about his connection to China and his influence in the world. Again, we're in a tiny little community, Fort Myers, but it was important to me that we sort of bring him back by saying, this is someone who's much larger, in terms of his position in the world. We've done a number of major Rauschenberg shows. The reason we're able to do so is because Bob was so generous. There's lots of art, even within a 5-mile radius of the gallery. Like his former assistants, his former partner, all live near us, so we've been able to really tap into extraordinary things in these private collections that have been local. But his relationship to the gallery itself, and the reason we ended up with his name, was that very early on in our inaugural season, Bob had a solo exhibition. And he loved that this could be a place that he could use as a laboratory, but also he really would try things out there. When he first moved to Captiva, he had a very modest studio, and he was having bigger and bigger ideas, literally. It was envisioning doing a 1/4-mile long work of art called the 1/4-mile or 2 furlong piece, but he could never see even a section of that really in his studio as he was making it. So he ended up world premiering it in our gallery as it was built in 3 parts over 3 years, which was just extraordinary. It's been shown now in China, it's been shown at Los Angeles County Museum of Art, it's been shown really all over the world, but at our then Edison Community College, we're now Florida Southwestern State College, but we were then Edison Community College. This was one of those, the first section, the second section, the third section of the 1/4-mile. So crazy history. But when he got to Florida originally, in 1970 to make it his permanent home, he had this history. If you know a little bit about Rauschenberg, he's known for the combine, and he's also known for this idea of working in the gap between art and life. And he would often walk around the block from his studio and pick up things that he would find, detritus often. He saw beauty in simple things, the idea that a Coke bottle could be a beautiful object, and he could incorporate it into a work of art, thrilled him. And when he got to Captiva, there really was no trash on the streets. So he, had to basically, in this first couple of year period, turn to the boxes that had transported his art and life to Florida and began to make artwork out of these boxes. There's a little bit of a trick here. A couple of these are actually clay pieces that were done at Graphic Studio in Tampa, but he did lots and lots of works during this period, 71, 72, 73, using cardboard boxes. There's that great property, the Ding Darling Fish House that he so loved. But this was an artist who'd been around the world. Again, we talked about China. He would say, and this was the first thing I sort of put on my emails as I would respond to people, Fort Myers is as small as your mind is. It can be just as large as the world is. I think everything that he did, he felt, would resonate broadly, and he'd been around the world making projects. He was the first Western contemporary artist to show in the Soviet Union. He showed at the time in the 80s in Cuba, in Chile under Pinochet, again in China, and in 10 countries during that period, which he called Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange. But he had first traveled actually to Europe with Cy Twombly, as you can see here in 1952, Italy and North Africa. This is actually the boat he went to Europe on with Cy Twombly. And he had a couple of his very first shows in Rome and Florence. This sort of speaks to him as someone who, was always about invention and also about not taking his own history or his own art too seriously in terms of its value. He had a show in Rome, it traveled to Florence, he was making these little almost fetish-like objects, and in Florence, when someone finally kind of paid attention, they wrote a really bad review of his work. And in fact, the critic suggested that the work, basically that he destroy the work, that it was too much about himself or too self-interested in a way. So Rauschenberg followed the critic's specific example and or instruction, and before leaving Florence, he threw all his work into the Arno River, just destroyed it. The entirety of his show in Florence, his second solo exhibition, he dumped into the river, right? So, and I think he thought of it in a funny way as a sort of conceptual end to that project, to that exhibition. At the same time, he was beginning to think about other ways of working. He began erasing his own drawings, and when no one cared, as they didn't care when he came back from Italy that he had destroyed all of his work, as he was destroying his own drawings, no one was paying attention, no one was sort of caring. He had made some all-white paintings, so he wanted to make all-white drawings, essentially, and that's why he started erasing his drawings. But then he reached out to the most famous artist of that moment that he had access to, Willem de Kooning, and he asked him for a drawing that he could erase. Then he was really taking something out of art history, right? So this is another kind of conceptually based work. Rauschenberg, I would argue, is the most important artist influential of the second half of the 20th century. Also, his work is the precursor for every major art movement that followed, that was post-war. So conceptualism, minimalism with the all-white paintings, and certainly pop art too, although he would never stick to those things, nor did he like to be categorized in that way. Here, a more conceptual work. This dates, again, to 1961. He'd been asked to do a portrait of this gallerist who was opening a gallery in Paris. He sends a telegram because he'd forgotten to do it. And the telegram simply says, "This is a portrait of Iris Clare if I say so," right? In terms of his impact, even within the market, obviously, one of his works sold for almost $90 million a few years ago. This is a work from 1964 called Buffalo 2. And importantly, in the mid-60s, when he was starting to get attention for, having won the Venice Biennale and began to connect with people in New York that he could collaborate with. He was truly an interdisciplinary artist. He was interested in collaboration with, people who were choreographers, dancers, musicians, but also engineers. He was really interested in the idea of working with the world's leading scientists. Here he's working with Billy Kluver, and they did a project that together that was called 9 Evenings. And this project was pairing artists with engineers to do these events over 9 nights. It leads directly to an organization that he then forms with some of these engineers that was called Experiments in Art and Technology, with the idea that they would work together to do things that were really unusual things, but that took the skill sets of all those involved. You know, he liked the thought of creative thinkers and artists being put into situations, be it with NASA, which later happens for him, or you know, to really rub up against and work together collaboratively with artists and engineers. This is the kind of thing that would be made. This is a work by Rauschenberg that is, if you go on YouTube and want to entertain yourself, there's a funny videos that people have shot. This now lives at the Modern Museet in Stockholm, but it's a piece that is, from Rauschenberg's perspective, a kind of painting of earth that would be horizontal painting, but that it's bubbling mud, essentially. It's called Mud Muse. And it reacts and responds to people in the room, basically. So as you move around it, it bubbles in different ways. And this, believe it or not, took years to make, and lots of, you know, talking to scientists about the viscosity of the mud and how can we keep it from stopping up the, you know, the size of the valves and the spouts and the, you know, so it's quite a complicated thing, plus the interactive aspect of it. But this was the kind of stuff that Experiments in Art and Technology took on. Rauschenberg also started making a series of prints and had been invited by NASA to be a kind of artist in residence in the 60s. You know, we were on our way to the moon. That was kind of the goal, obviously, with the Apollo 11. And he started using imagery from NASA, but also engaged deeply with them. Was invited to meet astronauts and to be on site while some of these things were happening. So he actually does ultimately attend or was there for, and the night before, with special access to the Apollo 11 launch. So you're seeing his kind of journal that he created during this time, and this is the night before. He talks about the rocket ship as a majestic bird here, and he says, breathing now half asleep, relaxing with fueling, the moon rose, because he was seeing the moon. This is at night, they're fueling the rocket for the Apollo 11. He said, my head said for the first time, the moon is going to have company, and knew it, right? So that meant he believed that by this next day, the rocket would be successfully heading toward the moon. These were the kinds of prints that he was doing at the time. He would use NASA-related imagery, some of his own imagery, and he would do lithography at this print workshop called Gemini, GEL, in Los Angeles. But that meant he was coming to Florida to engage, and to Houston and other centers for NASA. The day of the actual launch, this is the notes that he sort of kept. He says the Apollo 11 was airborne, lifting and pulling everyone's spirits with it. It's hard now to imagine how important that was, that we, you know, were successful in making our way, this incredibly ambitious thing, to the moon in such a short period of time, and at the time also sort of winning the space race. But I think Rauschenberg clearly understood that. There were celebrations really around the world, both of the astronauts, but also amongst artists. So there was a bar in New York City called Max's Kansas City. A lot of the Experiments in Art and Technology people would hang out there because the office for EAT was across the street from Max's. And, you know, you see Andy Warhol had a table in the back of Max's. The artist on the right here, the guy in the middle with his tongue out, is a lesser known person, but he actually was very central to these group of friends. His name was Forrest Frosty Myers, and he's actually still alive, and he lives up in St. Augustine, so not far. But Frosty, at this moment when everyone was celebrating the success in our landing a man on the moon, turned to this group of engineers, and he said, he said, this is fantastic. We've accomplished this incredible thing. We've stepped on another terrestrial body. We're successfully have brought back these astronauts. We've won the space race, but as artists, shouldn't we be thinking about sending something of our culture to the moon? We've won the space race. We've planted our flag nationalistically, leaving that behind, but everything else that we've left is really trash. It's detritus. We've left trash on the moon. And as artists, wouldn't it be amazing that we might find a way to send art to the moon? And of course, with these engineers, immediately they turn on their engineer hats and say, well, okay, we're Bell Laboratories. Billy Kluver worked for Bell Laboratories. Fred Waldauer worked for Bell Laboratories. We had the transistor team. We're quite capable of making something tiny that wouldn't interfere with a moon mission, right? They were in a position where every ounce counts. So Frosty, who makes large-scale sculptures, outdoor sculptures, couldn't possibly send a giant sculpture to the moon, but these involved with Bell Laboratories could certainly suggest they were doing microcircuitry, right? So Frosty could do that. Frosty, remarkably, given his friendships, knew that he was probably the least famous of the artists in the room. So he turned to the other artists and he said, instead of me just making the effort to send art to the moon, why don't we have a collective effort, amongst these American artists? He was there with Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, Klaus Oldenburg, and others. So he decides, wouldn't it be much more interesting should we all try to participate in this? The Bell Labs guys immediately said, okay, plan A, which they assumed would work, is all the astronauts as they would, go into space or on any launch, but certainly as they were going to the moon, would have a personal preference pack, which was basically this pocket that they could bring small little things with them to bring back. So it could be, a bunch of American flags that would be rolled up. It could be cufflinks. It could be a roll of stamps. And when they came back, they could give to friends, sign it, and say, this has been to the moon, right? As a little gift, a souvenir. But all those things had to be weighed, tested. They couldn't have magnetic properties. They couldn't be. So knowing that, they thought, well, we'll propose that one of the astronauts on the Apollo XII actually take this museum they were going to create to the moon that way. This is actually ultimately what they produced. It has 6 drawings by 6 artists, including Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg's is that little straight line at the top. For Bob, he would talk about it as either sort of a vapor trail or the idea that really, for him, the artist's mark, it didn't have to be a drawing per se, but the artist's mark was the equivalent of an astronaut's boot print. Just getting a line to the moon was an incredible accomplishment. Andy Warhol, you'll see as we go through, I can tell you a little more about individual artists. Those are the positions and those are the 6 artists. And that's detail about sort of how it was made, this little ceramic wafer. And the engineers who were involved at Bell Laboratories doing this after hours. That's one of Forrest's sculptures, Frosty Meyer's sculptures. And this, he ends up plotting in a computer at MIT with engineers, and the image that actually ends up on the Moon Museum is one of the first computer drawings. And in fact, they had plotted it so that it could move in virtual space, so it was without gravity essentially, but they took a screen grab of it as it was rotating, and that little drawing becomes his contribution to the Moon Museum. As you can see there, lower left is Frosty Forrest Myers, and it's based on this piece he calls Laser Days or Interconnectivity. And at the time, that's the kind of computer they would have plotted it out on, basically. And it had sort of a joystick, and the joystick, you could actually move it in virtual space. So he thought that was the most advanced thing that he could send to represent culture as well, was something that dealt with technology, and the idea of sending a computer drawing in the late 60s was extraordinary, right? So Andy Warhol, you can decide, he would say it was a rocket ship, but Warhol also had his own connection to the, to NASA and using imagery that was related. He was just being a bad boy, basically, and thought he would sort of tag the moon with this, that image. Klaus Oldenburg at the time was doing things that were related sort of to Mickey Mouse, his own version. He did a mouse museum and these geometric mouse sculptures. He thought that certainly if someone would succeed in sending something of culture to the moon, it was going to be Disney, that actually Mickey Mouse would probably be the first image that would make its way to the moon. But because he'd been asked and Disney had not, he thought, I'm going to send my geometric mouse to the moon. And so he made a drawing of the mouse, but he did it as a kite. So the idea was it was breaking gravity somehow. And you'll see it in the middle on the bottom there. When they made the moon museums, it was an after-hours project. The artists ended up being sent one. It was done as a multiple. Because when they did microcircuitry, basically, they'd have this ceramic plate, and they'd do multiple of the same images, and then they'd be cut with a diamond saw. And we think that 24 were made, basically. We know of now the existence of 12. I've been spending years trying to track them down. The Museum of Modern Art, it's the smallest object in their permanent collection. They were gifted one by an engineer. Andy Warhol's is in the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, occasionally on exhibit. The Metropolitan Museum has one, actually. The National Gallery of Art has one. And they don't get shown very often, nor do they almost ever get lent. So we think 24, we know of about, again, 12 now, where they're at, which artists still have them and or their estates. But as they were being made, they had a very short window between Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, and it was, about, I forget, 6 months or something. And so they were trying to get this done and get the permissions to have it be carried by one of the astronauts in this limited amount of time. They knew lots of people. They knew congressmen, they knew museum directors, they knew, and certainly those around Bell Laboratories were connected to the Apollo missions anyway. But the artists didn't manage. They couldn't, no one ever wrote them back. So in the end, through the Bell Laboratories friends and engineers, during this period when they were not getting permission, they thought, we've got to come up with another alternative. Like, we're not convincing NASA that they should allow us to put one in a personal preference pack and have Alan Bean drop it on the lunar surface. So they decided that they would send one without permission to their friends at Grumman here on Cape Canaveral, and they were working on the LIM 6, which are the landing legs, right? So when the astronauts arrived to the lunar surface, this comes down and then the landing legs stay behind and the capsule returns the astronauts, right? But the landing legs, they knew, are going to stay on the lunar surface, and that was the goal with this little museum, that it would stay on the lunar surface. So without permission, they had a Grumman engineer attach it to the landing legs of the LIM 6. And they came back, of course, after the success of the Apollo 12 celebrated worldwide, and NASA had no idea that they had sent art to the moon, that it had been a secret sort of passenger, right? But one of the engineers from Grumman, without revealing his actual name, but knowing, of course, that it was John F. Kennedy who had started the whole mission to the moon, decided that he would send Frosty a note, and you can see when it's dated there, it's actually before they'd returned safely, but he said, you're on, A-OK, all systems go. So Frosty had a actual confirmation from, Cape Canaveral, from this secret or pseudonym of a Grumman employee who had access and and we know it wasn't a John F. because there's not a John F. in the Grumman yearbook from the time that had access. So it's clearly someone just making up a name so they didn't get fired or lose their career over sending this little object. And that's it. So I actually have built some exhibitions in and around telling this history. And we did one at the Rauschenberg Gallery. This is sort of showing it with some of the flown objects and other things, Kapton foil, et cetera. But as a sort of exhibition in my pocket, this original Moon Museum, I've actually brought one. So you guys are welcome to come up and take a peek. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. But thank you for inviting me. And also, again, I've got a Moon Museum here. So you're welcome to come have a look. I've been taking it around all over at the invitation of the US State Department and other museums. And we've done a number of exhibitions around it, but happy to have it here for the first time, I think, in Orlando. So thank you, guys.